Andrea, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. So South Africa is generally a very dry country, having suffered severe droughts over the past 6 to 9 years. So is it uncommon for the National Disaster Management Centre to classify a national disaster due to severe rainfall and flooding in large parts of the country?
Good afternoon, Anlie. It's a common phenomenon. We get dry cycles and we get wet cycles. With the recent heavy rainfall, floods and hail damage spanning over several provinces the last few weeks, we've seen that the Disaster Management Centre has issued a national disaster classification, and this is done in terms of Section 23 of the Disaster Management Act. But this classification in principle means that now recommendation information was received from provincial disaster management centres that the extent of disaster exceeds the capability of provinces and municipalities to deal with the disaster. Now the national executive are mainly responsible. So in light with the recent rains, it's very welcomed. We have seen droughts between 6 to 9 years already in large parts of the country. And now with these recent rains, it's welcomed. However, we know that with these rainfall, there is now loss to life. There is also damage to infrastructure and also crop losses being reported.
Can you tell us, Andrea, which parts of the country have been worst affected?
Well, it's mostly the summer rainfall districts. We have, especially in the agricultural sector, we've seen reports that the Western Free State, there's producers that lost up to 100% of crops. There's flooding in the KwaZulu-Natal province, northwest. There was hail reported in Limpopo. We've seen it in Gauteng. So it's basically a large part of the country, and there's also high flow in rivers. So from your Vaal to your Orange River, so it's impacting across or spanning across a few provinces.
Agri SA reports that some farmers have suffered 100% crop losses. And not only is it too late to replant, but they've also suffered devastating losses in terms of input, such as fertilizer. Many farmers don't have the kind of reserves required to recover from such losses. Does that mean we're looking at a number of producers closing shop, as it were?
I don't think per se that they will close shop. I think what happened now is these floods only occurred in certain districts in certain provinces. So we can only really determine the extent of what this damage would be to food security, and it won't impact national food security at all. But we'll see at harvest season, what is the extent of damages being suffered by producers. Like you've rightly mentioned, high input costs such as fertilizer and fuel already spent in planting has now is lost due to these damages occurred because farmers can't re-enter their fields to replant. We're standing at the end of the planting season. There's also a ripple effect naturally on job losses. So, but it will just impact certain districts where there was high flooding in certain crop areas.
We know the national disaster allows government to deploy the SANDF and SAPS and other organs of state to help manage the disaster, but I want to find out more specifically about funding that will be redirected to disaster relief and government's partnerships with organisations like Agri SA to provide dedicated assistance on a practical level to producers who ensure food security for all South Africans. And practical, like how are these farmers who've lost 100% of their crops and who can't replant now, how are they going to receive assistance?
So how organised agriculture at this stage is trying to lobby through this National Disaster Management Centre. We are also part of the National Joint Flood Coordination Committee, in which we can provide inputs and data through the NDMC. And obviously, we also work with provincial and municipal provincial disaster management centres. But like I also want to say is the reason for this classification is meant to ensure coordination and implementation of the Disaster Management Act by all three spheres of government in applying existing contingency plans. So there is existing contingency plans by the NDMC. And now provincial and municipal government are requested to reprioritise their current budgets where the existing budgets can be used for this post-disaster recovery to mitigate the impacts. Alternatively, provincial disaster management centres or government can now apply to National Treasury for further funding. So at this stage, we are hopeful that there will be funds available for post-disaster recovery, especially in the agricultural sector. But the main priority currently for farmers, and that we're seeing, is just that the government should look into repairing road infrastructure and bridges. We know that rural towns are mainly left behind with road infrastructure, and it just has worsened with all this rain. So yeah, from Agri SA Organised Agriculture, we would like to see that road infrastructure are properly repaired and that impact assessments are properly conducted. We are encouraging a lot of farmers to please contact your your provincial disaster management center, organised agricultural offices, so that you can complete these impact assessments, so that there is quantitative data. There's quantitative data so that the government can determine the extent of the damages.
Thank you so much. That was Andrea Campher, Risk and Disaster Manager from Agri SA.